Welcome everybody to this De Morgan Collection talk on William de Morgan's life and work in celebration of him being born on this day, the 16th of November in 1839. My name is Sarah Hardy and I'm the curator and manager of the De Morgan Collection. William was born, as I've said, in London in 1839 on the 16th of November to esteemed parents Augustus de Morgan, who's here on the left, and his mother, Sophia Friend, on the right-hand side. Augustus and Sophia met through mathematical circles. Sophia's father, William Friend, was an esteemed mathematician, as was William's father, Augustus de Morgan, and the two of them had a professional relationship before Augustus was introduced to William's daughter, and the two of them married and went on to have 7 children, of which William was the second and the eldest boy, their first son. It really does seem like the De Morgan children had quite a fantastic childhood growing up. They were loved, I think, and cared for directly by their parents, which was quite unusual for middle-class parents of the time, not to have a nanny or a nursery maid, but Sophia de Morgan took on all of that herself. And we have a charming object in the De Morgan Foundation's archive, which is the nursery journal that she kept to explain her parenting, how she was bringing the children up and how they were getting along. And really, William's parents were quite extraordinary in lots of different ways, not just in their approach to parenting, very generous and very open for the time, very different to the usual standard of children being seen and not heard, which was the Victorian expectation. But William's father was the first professor of mathematics at University College London. He had wanted to take up a professorship at Cambridge University, which is where he had studied, but to go on to be a professor at the time, one had to be ordained as a priest, which he flatly refused to do on religious grounds. He certainly wasn't a Christian and aligned himself to no particular religion, not even atheism, and so decided to take up a career in law instead. Fortuitously for him and for us, University College London was established that year, and at the age of just 21, he was appointed to the position of Professor of Mathematics, a relatively new subject, which was being studied at the time, and he held that position throughout his life. William's mother, Sophia Friend, again, an amazing person with this wonderful career. She started off her career as a social reform campaigner and campaigned widely for prison reforms. She was anti-vivisection and she was an abolitionist as well. So she fought tirelessly for the abolition of slavery. As well as these things, she was a spiritual medium, a practicing medium, and we are very fortunate to have her writings, which describe her adventures, I suppose, in spiritual mediumship, which is a fascinating thing to have, very much thought of as a science at the time, not so much the more pseudoscience we might view it as today. So that's how William grew up, and this fantastic object in the Foundation's archive, I think, really gets to the heart of that very progressive, forward-thinking education that William and his siblings were afforded at the hands of these wonderful parents. And here we have a juvenile drawing of birds on the right-hand side of the screen. I think you can see my cursor. So these are birds. And you can see in Sophia de Morgan's hand, Alice's drawing, 3.5 years old. So Alice was William's sister. And across from that here on the left-hand side, you can see what's really written on the reverse on the 2nd of December are these long equations that have been written out by hand. And I rather think that this is probably, or was probably, a piece of homework set by Professor de Morgan for one of his students that has then been flipped over and used as scrap paper for the children to add their drawings to the back of, which I think just, it's wonderful to have something that touches on so many members of the De Morgan family in our archives preserved. And I think it really shows that sort of really wonderful childhood that William had. William's first attempts at artwork can be seen here, one of his earliest proper attempts at painting, in this self-portrait, which we think is probably from about 1859. Maybe a little bit earlier. He would have been 20 in 1859. I think he looks a little bit younger than that, but we can't be certain of a date. But you can see that he's picturing himself here as quite astute, forward-looking out from the canvas at us, and he does have a very good control in this early image of paint, of how to handle it, how to apply that to the canvas, and how to put together this wonderfully quite engaging self-portrait, which is, no mean feat. And I think it really shows off that he had this innate artistic skill, which he put to good work as an artist. And this is something that's quite often skirted over with De Morgan, but he actually, despite us knowing him best for his pottery, was an established and pretty good fine artist in a range of different media before he came to ceramics. So he started his artistic training proper with someone called Francis Carey at Carey's drawing school in Bloomsbury, just by University College London. So it was close to home, and so he was able to train with Carey probably around the same time as he was finishing his education at the University College schools with his father. So a very well-educated, very well-rounded education that De Morgan received there. But this watercolour painting is now in the collection of the National Trust and is on display at Whitwick Manor. You can see that De Morgan is attempting to draw from the figure, draw from life. He actually does a pretty good baby, and his, which is quite unusual for a lot of artists to be able to depict an infant accurately. So it really does show off that he was, like I said, quite an astute artist. Very much based on a Renaissance Italian picture. You can see that the woman in the middle there, this billowing cloak, very reminiscent of Titian, with these reds and blues contrasting each other as well, something that certainly would have been taught at the Academy. And drawing from the classical sculpture, again, something that was taught at the Academy quite rigorously. And that's the education that he would have received at Carey's as well in preparation for his time at the Royal Academy. So this beautiful biblical subject here of Moses being found in the bulrushes by William De Morgan. His oil painting is also, not bad. I think he didn't have quite as much confidence in his own painting, and in his own words, he never became a real artist. But these pieces certainly show that he had a good stab at that, and you can see again his innate artistic skill. So as well as biblical subjects, he also handled mythological subjects, as was expected of fine artists during this period. So here we have Pan by William De Morgan, playing of course on his panpipes on the left hand side, and that's in the De Morgan Foundation's collection. It's not a particularly big oil painting, it's just probably about A3 size. But on the right hand side we have a much larger work that was sold by Bonhams in the 1970s and again in the early 2000s, and the painting here depicts Ariadne at Naxos. Ariadne abandoned by Theseus after she'd helped him defeat the Minotaur. And you can see here this painting very clearly resembles a Renaissance painting, with that drama displayed across Ariadne's face as she discovers her abandonment. We've got the wonderful swirling, billowing drapes, and again that red and blue paint colour directly opposing each other. However, the picture's in one of these sort of what I like to call an upturned letterbox formation, a very more than portrait sort of vertical drop on this picture, and it's this wonderful full-length portrait of Ariadne. So the narrative becomes a little bit secondary in this case to the beauty of the piece, which was definitely something that was popularised at the time that De Morgan was having his art education. So you can see that De Morgan, he had this fine art education. He had wonderful application of his ideas to the paint, and the canvas. And these paintings really do show that off. A final of his works that I wanted to show you was The Alchemist's Daughter, again, probably painted in the 1860s by De Morgan, and it shows off this, like so many different elements in this painting that I wanted to draw your attention to. We've got the patterned curtain on the left-hand side with that rich detail that's been painted into the folds and the drapery of the curtain. His approach to handling the furniture, again, shows this to be the wonderful graphic design of that carved wood. We've got the perspective going off into the distance, where the blue colours take over from the red to give us that tonal view of perspective. And I think it really is a very clever picture. Like I said, De Morgan didn't really think that he was a particularly good fine artist, but I hope that I've shown you in some way. I certainly think that he was. Despite all of that, he only ever entered one painting into the Royal Academy's summer exhibition, and that was in 1863, and it is this portrait of a girl. We think it's possibly his niece, Millicent de Morgan, but that is unproven, unfortunately. But again, you can see it's this quite charming portrait, it's wonderful background decoration, very good use of drapery on the picture, an incredibly engaging portrait, again leaning on Renaissance painting, of which the fashion was to have the face painted completely in profile. So there we are, that's a run through of De Morgan's very sort of brief career in oil painting before he really discovered what it was that made him tick, and that was in no short way indebted to these two gentlemen, William Morris on the left and Edward Burne-Jones on the right-hand side. It was through the connections De Morgan had made at the Royal Academy, in particular his friend, the artist Henry Holliday, who had introduced him to William Morris in 1863. And after that point, De Morgan completely diverted from the fine arts to devote his career as a craftsman. So something that Morris was really fighting against was the fine arts, painting, sculpture, being considered on a different plane to craft. Through his work, producing crafts and producing art pieces through his craft, these sort of wonderful pieces of furniture that would be handmade, created as art and sculpture were, and he was trying to elevate the status of the two to be the same. But that never really happened, and these two different art forms are still considered really on different planes today. But De Morgan was part of that arts and crafts circle, and as so many of the craftsmen associated with the arts and crafts movement, they did have this grounding in painting and drawing and figurative work, as De Morgan did. Something that is wonderful to sort of think about, and that comes through a lot in the writings and the descriptions of De Morgan by his contemporaries, such as Morris and Burne-Jones, is that he was really quite an engaging and funny man. And I think this charming letter to his niece Fanny really shows that off. He's able to draw these tiny characters throughout the letter to make it very engaging and very amenable to a child. You've seen that he painted one of his nieces. Whilst De Morgan never went on to have any children of his own, he was an uncle to many of his friends' children, including Morris and Burne-Jones's children, and this letter really shows off that sort of really charming and engaging side of his personality. In her biography of her husband's life, Georgiana Burne-Jones stated that she first knew of De Morgan whilst he was living up at Gower Street, near the University College with his father, and that she learnt of his incredible wit long before she learnt of sort of how good a friend he could be. So I think that sort of puts him in a pretty lovely light. So stained glass was the first craft that De Morgan really applied himself to, and here we have a wonderful example of the work he completed in stained glass. very much leaning on the same ideas, of course, as he was producing at the Royal Academy, these biblical scenes, characters from the Bible, very much in that same format as some of his earlier oil paintings were, in order to produce glass for windows. It's no surprise really that was the vertical format that was needed for these glorious, beautiful church windows. He really does sort of fill his characters with a sense of movement. You see that in the wonderful drapery, but also his pattern making is very evident from this early age. I mentioned that William's father was a mathematician, and I think that he was quite interested in the subject of mathematics, certainly of scientific investigation, as much as he was in the design element. And I think that's probably why stained glass appealed to him more so than any of the other crafts. Remember, Morris and Co. at this time were making wallpapers, they were making furniture, but it was the stained glass that De Morgan was particularly interested in. He also worked for a short time as an apprentice to another stained glass maker at Fitzroy Square in London, and had an apartment next to him. So we know through these two different sources he really was quite interested in pursuing stained glass. Something he noticed about the glass was that the process of painting the silver nitrate paste onto the sheets of glass and firing that in the kiln at a critical temperature. If the kiln became blocked or starved of oxygen, the silver nitrate would actually oxidize and leave an iridescent film on the surface of the glass. This very complex sort of scientific process, the chemical reactions involved in that, reminded De Morgan of luster glazing, and it's really a combination of that, plus the fact that not many other arts and crafts people, members of that circle, were making ceramics at that time, so hence creating a gap in the market, that after about 10 years of making the glass with Morris & Co., De Morgan fell into the ceramics business. I also just wanted to show you this. This is another example of De Morgan's oil on canvas, but this is in turn a cartoon for the finished glass. But again, it just shows his skill as a fine artist. And I think if you look at the bushes and the oranges in the background, those of you very familiar with De Morgan's designs will recognise that same motif as some of his later tiles. So what we see is that all these different media that he was using all build up and culminate with the ceramics. Again, showing off De Morgan's range is this cabinet by his friend Philip Webb. Philip Webb was known to De Morgan through William Morris, and the William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow has this fine piece of Webb furniture with these decorative panels. These are again based on mythological characters and very similar to De Morgan's oil painting, but they have this wonderful burnished gold background. And after De Morgan's time at Fitzroy Square, a rented property he was forced to leave when his scientific investigations of his own, doing his own meddling, had led him to blow up the fireplace by trying to have a makeshift kiln in there, and he was soon sort of sent away by the landlord. So I did what anyone in that position would do and moved back in with Mum. Mum at the time lived on Cheney Row in Chelsea, and so that's where De Morgan moved to and set up his first pottery properly. You can see here, this is number 5 with a plaque of Thomas Carlyle on the side of it, about 1900. De Morgan lived at number 8, so that's about here. Sadly, I didn't have a picture of that side of the street, but the numbering's changed slightly and it's now number 30. So if you want to go and see where this house was, it's number 30 that you're looking for. So there we go, Cheney Row in Chelsea, right next to the embankment. The Victorian embankment had been built at that time, and so this area was really changing and developing, but still very much felt like the countryside rather than the bustling centre of London, and it was very much an artistic community. De Morgan counted amongst his neighbours great painter Turner and the pre-Raphaelite artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Both lived within walking distance from De Morgan's house in Chelsea, so a real artistic hub. And you'd hope that that would mean that the neighbours wouldn't mind so much the billowing smoke caused by his coal kiln in the garden, but I don't know. And we have wonderful descriptions written by those who knew De Morgan from this period, who talk about sort of coming and visiting the house, the girls inevitably working upstairs, painting De Morgan's designs onto the tiles, then being fired in the garden, and eventually De Morgan took a lease on the building at the end of the row, Orange House, to sell the tiles. One of his first commissions for tiles possibly came through leads from working so much on ecclesiastical designs with the windows. And he was given a commission to create these religious themes, these religious figures, for an altarpiece at Hornblotton Church in Somerset. And we know these are from 1872, so very early into Morgan's ceramics career, because Somerset Records Office has this receipt, which is on the left-hand side of the screen, made out to De Morgan in 1872 for the decoration of this church. So you see that the gradual progression towards the ceramics was really quite long. You know, after 10 years after dropping out of the Royal Academy and working on his drawing and his oil painting, he eventually moved into the ceramics, but that was very much via the work on the stained glass windows. And I pointed out the orange tree in the window, and you can see it there again in this decorative tile panel for the altar. Even though De Morgan was now very well established by 1877, working on his ceramics, he still would turn his hand to other forms of artwork. And I think this just starts to show you sort of what a creative genius he was. We've seen the furniture design, we've seen the stained glass, the oil paintings, his drawings are amazing. Well, he also turned his hands to woodblock printing to decorate his sister Mary De Morgan's volume of fairy tales called On a Pincushion. It's a charming book, which is written from the point of view of, I think, a hat pin, a tie pin, and another piece of jewellery, a brooch, I think, who've been left on a pincushion all day long. And to pass the time, they tell each other fairy stories. So a wonderful book written by William's sister, and William was contracted to decorate the whole thing with these glorious woodblock prints. And there we have the character, the vain Lamora, staring at her reflection in the water, engraved by De Morgan. So if you'll notice again, this upturned vertical composition for the character there just shows that he definitely did have a style, despite applying himself across all of these different crafts. So as I mentioned, by 1880, moved on in time a little bit, De Morgan was still at Chelsea. He'd nearly been there for 10 years. At this point, he was so well known that he was producing these catalogues which showed off the different tiles that you could buy from his Orange House pottery, which, as I said, was at the end, right at the end of the row on Cheney Row in London. And there we have the beautiful illustrated catalogue. On the right-hand side, it's the Mongolian patterned tiles, which are just one of the designs listed in this catalogue. This starts to show off a different influence, I think, on De Morgan's creative output from the ones that we've seen. This beautiful double repeated pattern needs 4 tiles, as you see it there, in order to repeat. So you start to see he's leaning very much on his mathematical skill here, rather than his more creative artistic training, because in order to get this pattern to work symmetrically, but also on the repeat with this beautiful arabesque curve, takes quite a lot of sort of rigorous planning and training to achieve something so beautiful. Designs like that by De Morgan were absolutely influenced by a commission that he won in the 1870s from an architect called George Aitchison to install Lord Leighton's own collection of Damascus tiles into his Arab Hall extension of his Holland Park home. What a joy to have not only this wonderful studio home in Holland Park, but decide that you need an extension building on it, and that being the result. So that just shows you what a wealthy man Lord Leighton was, and an artistic one as well. He went on to be president of the Royal Academy. So De Morgan was moving in these artistic circles and was quite well known already, this early in his career, just 5 years after setting out as a ceramic designer, as the ceramic designer. And through his work with different architects, he did win various commissions, but installing these original Damascene tiles into Leighton's Arab Hall certainly gave him a flavour for Islamic art and design, and that came through in many of his designs throughout his career, such as the Mongolian tiles that we have just seen. More of these wonderful colourways can be seen on this coloured and illustrated page from a Morris & Co catalogue, which shows off the De Morgan tiles that you could buy from Morris & Co. So Morris was a great supporter of De Morgan's career and De Morgan's business throughout his own career, and wherever you could buy a Morris wallpaper, tapestry, curtain or carpet, you could also purchase De Morgan tiles to match it. It's absolutely no accident that all of De Morgan's designs, such as Rose and Trellis from 1863, had a De Morgan tile that would match up to them, so that you could go about having this overall aesthetic interior in your home. In the 1880s, Oscar Wilde had been travelling through America and then eventually in the UK lecturing on the House Beautiful. He very much lent on William Morris's and on John Ruskin's teaching that you should not have anything in your home that you do not know to be useful or believed to be beautiful. That's a quote that gets sort of reused all the time when talking about Morris's theory, but that's something that Oscar Wilde absolutely pinned on, and he gave his House Beautiful lecture across the UK, across America, really determining what should be included in an aesthetic home, and these sort of tiles are absolutely that. These were another commission that De Morgan won in the late 1870s from an architect called Richard Norman Shaw, who De Morgan worked with a number of times. And Norman Shaw had been enlisted to create Bedford Park, which is close to Chiswick in West London, and Norman Shaw's sort of ethos was all based around this idea of the House Beautiful, the arts and crafts home. Everything was handmade and beautiful, and De Morgan's tiles, Bedford Park Daisy, Bedford Park Anemone, were made to be installed in houses in Bedford Park. And there are some very lucky people who still live in Norman Shaw houses who still have De Morgan fireplaces in the interior of their homes today. One of De Morgan's sort of best known commissions, I think, was from Lewis Carroll when he was still at Christ Church in Oxford, where he was studying mathematics. These tiles are, I just think they're absolutely wonderful. So the image at the top there gives you an idea of what the tiles are like when you can see them in colour, but the black and white photograph shows them when they were installed in what was Lewis Carroll's fireplace in his rooms at Oxford whilst he was still living there. So we sail away on this magnificent medieval galleon with these huge fish leaping out of the water. So it is all quite funny, and it's got that sort of wonderful De Morgan wit and again this dynamism about it. And as we sail away, you can see the creatures around the image of the fireplace at the bottom there, very much based on fantasy mixed with reality, these wonderful creations in his animals, again filled with this sort of charm and this human personality that makes you sort of get a sense of De Morgan's wit again, I think. And these tiles sort of were lifted, the ideas from them very much informed by Lewis Carroll's fantasy poems and stories. And these went to Christ Church in the 1880s. By 1882, De Morgan had outgrown Chelsea. As I said, he was in a house he was living in with his mother and his sister, and using the upstairs rooms for the decorating of the tiles, a kiln in the back garden. And really, his ambition had long been beyond what was possible living on a terrace street in Chelsea. So he moved his ceramic works out to Merton Abbey, which is near Wimbledon. outside of the city into the countryside, where his friend Willie Morris already had premises, and he set up a larger workshop here. You can see the tile stamp design on the reverse of this tile from the Merton Abbey period. And what this shows is that De Morgan also had the staff available to him. He was employing up to about 40 people, and also had the means available and space available to do things like make his own tiles. And really, it was this period at Merton where he wasn't so worried about money, and he did have this space and resource. I think that it gives us some of De Morgan's most creative output, whether that's from designing huge dishes and chargers with these wonderful repeat patterns around the edges of them, or whether it was making hollowware. The Merton Abbey period really was one of his most exciting, I think. Having that space and having people available to throw pots for him led to some really quite exciting designs, such as this bull vase. So this would have been made to De Morgan's own specification. You can see the undulating stem of the vase, and then this huge globed top is quite unlike anything from any other time period or place. It really is a sort of a figment of De Morgan's brilliant imagination, and you can see the symmetrical bulls at the top there, recalling his interest in Islamic art and culture, but then their wonderful tails curve round to form the handles. So a really wonderfully inventive piece. If you've heard me lecture on De Morgan before, you've probably heard me mention the fish and net vase, one that I think, and one that May Morris thought when she wrote De Morgan's obituary. This is a vase that she picked out as being sort of the pinnacle of his design, and as I said, I completely agree with her. You'll notice this wonderful bulging vase has a tessellating net pattern which twists and grows as the vase expands, and so the pattern is absolutely made to mimic and show off and really help us to look at the form of the ceramic. So the two were designed to be complementary, much more exciting than just the tile designs that he was able to produce at Chelsea. But then if you look under this net design, you'll see actually that what's being caught in this bulging net is a shoal of fish. And so again, we've just got that De Morgan humour really coming through. How those wonderful fish have been painted under a white net is again shows De Morgan's application of his scientific inquiry and mathematical knowledge to his designs, because the net pattern would actually be drawn on first in wax on top of a plain glazed surface. The very detailed fish would then be painted on in this wonderful lustre glaze, a copper oxide to give us the red lustre. Once that had been fired, of course, the kiln with its heat would melt away the wax and leave us with this fish and net vase. So that is just, I think, a beautiful example of what De Morgan & Co were able to produce at Merton Abbey. The final period of De Morgan's practice in ceramics is his Fulham period. In 1887, on the 5th of March, he married his wife, Evelyn De Morgan. He was 45 and she was 32 at the time they married, so they both already had very well-established careers. Hers was as a painter. She certainly saw that as the higher art, and in terms of bringing the pair income, it definitely was the higher art, as her income far outweighed his in what was a marriage that really turned gender roles on its head. William went on to be the vice president of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, so we know that supporting women and supporting this movement towards equality was definitely something that he was intent on. And I'm sure something that really would have helped him to, with that view, if he didn't have it already, is the fact that when the couple married, Evelyn De Morgan put £4,000 of her own money, about £300,000 by today's money, for him to go into business with her Halsey Ricardo and set up a partnership scholarship, and to establish a factory in Fulham, and also to build a new showroom. So we moved out of the Orange House showroom on Cheney Row and set up a shop front on Great Marlborough Street, which was opposite Liberty, so in a very fashionable west end of London, to sell his ceramic wares and to go into further production in Fulham. And it was during the Fulham period that De Morgan's lustreware really was perfected. You can see this fantastic example of what's known as his Moonlight suite. So not only do we have the beautiful red copper oxide that we can see in this piece that we saw in previous examples, but De Morgan was experimenting with adding silver oxide and running the ceramics through the kiln twice at different critical temperatures to allow the metallic glaze to oxidize and leave that wonderful iridescent metallic film on the ceramic surface. And this is an example of what he was able to achieve during this period, these absolutely stunning ceramics. During the Fulham period as well, it's when De Morgan won much more ambitious commissions than he had been doing previously through architects and artists. And this is a sketch for a frieze that would have adorned a dairy. You can see we've got some cows, some lovely swans, and these brilliant cherubs churning butter on the left-hand side. Absolutely charming design for a dairy at Westwood House in Sydenham in London. De Morgan also won the commission to design the interiors of 12 different P&O, Peninsula and Orient cruise ships, still a company that many of you will know exists today. But he was commissioned in the 1880s and 90s to create these wonderful tiled interiors. So he imagined the voyages that passengers would take on these sort of absolutely indulgent and elaborately designed ships that were the height of fashion for travel around the world. And these are some of the this is a fantastic example rather of the results of his work and of his him being sort of allowed the freedom to let his imagination run wild, really. So we have these, again, the ships that we saw in some of his earlier designs, but now we have these ones adorned with a little Maltese flag, so we know that these were for the SS Malta. These wonderful Technicolor, an absolute explosion and celebration of colour and the breadth of colours that De Morgan was able to produce from the kiln at this time. This tile panel, fortuitously, was made as a spare by De Morgan, whether that was for the showroom, so it could be shown off as to potential clients for other projects whilst the ships were all out, or so that it could be used as a spare in case any damage happened whilst the ships were at sea, so that the company could very quickly go in and make replacements. We're not sure, but it will have been made for one of those two reasons. But I say fortuitously is that it meant that this piece survived, whereas very sadly 6 of the ships that had De Morgan interiors are at the bottom of the sea, and 6 were broken up when they were decommissioned. So from all of this vast output and these amazing ceramic interiors, very few pieces from the P&O commission survived, but our galleon tile panel is certainly a brilliant piece to have. As well as his experiments and his designs in his ceramics, that wasn't enough for De Morgan. As I've said, he was a man, I think, of great inventive nature, who absolutely wanted to work out how and why things were made and how they were done. And this is a sketch that belongs to the V&A. It's in the V&A Prints and Drawings Archive, and it's the plans, elevations and sections of kilns and associating machinery. So De Morgan wasn't content with using other people's kilns or an off-the-peg kiln to make his ceramics. He went one step further to enhance, I think, his own understanding, but also the perfection of what he was producing by designing his own kilns. There were also designs in the V&A's archive for things like submarines. he was quite interested in designing submarines when the First World War hit, and he thought that his designs would be much better than those that were already out at sea. So someone who's very interested in lots of different pursuits, and someone who also, not just engaged with on the ideas level, but the practical application of those. And his designs for his own kiln, I think, really show that off. Following his marriage to Evelyn de Morgan in 1887, William and Evelyn started to spend their winters in Italy. And the inscription on the top right-hand side of this painting by Evelyn de Morgan, I beg your pardon, of her husband William, tells us that it was painted in Florence in 1893. And from sort of about October through to about March, over each year, the de Morgans would move out to Florence. During that time, their beloved home at number 1, the Vale in Chelsea, was rented out to Walter Sickert, part of the Camden group of painters. So again, it shows that they were very well connected with lots of different artists, not just with the arts and crafts movement artists I think we associate them with. But they loved being out in Florence, and whilst it did cause some pressure on de Morgan running his business back in the UK, it also allowed him to collaborate with Cantagalli, a Florentine potter, and we get some of de Morgan's most ambitious designs, certainly in terms of the form of the ceramic he was decorating from this collaboration with Cantagalli. It's very rare that de Morgan ceramics have these additional embellishments and these grotesques and these additional clay features on them when they are just de Morgan & Co. It's only really through the Cantagalli collaboration that these come about. And yet within that, there's still some aspects of the design that are so typically de Morgan, such as this rim just below the neck of the vase here, which has this same kind of fleur-de-lis pattern, which we actually saw on the reredos for the church in Holmblotton some 30 years of his career earlier. So even though de Morgan was constantly inventive and producing different pieces and different designs in a range of media, he actually stuck to the same imagery quite a lot throughout his career. And here we see him sort of quite close to the end of his time with a wonderful three-dimensional ceramic piece, which is now in the collection of the V&A and amongst some of his vases. The de Morgans went out to Italy for the last time in 1914 before returning permanently to the UK. And Italy had been such an important aspect of their married life, but also on their creative output, as we saw with the Cantagalli vase, that it was quite a blow to leave it. But I think they were both happy to sort of go into retirement, especially as the pottery business had been possibly, failing for some time by this point. And actually, in 1907, it closed for good. I've mentioned the fact that de Morgan used the same images over and over again, and really, by the turn of the century, his ceramics were quite unfashionable. People weren't wanting to buy them, and very sadly, he stated that now he could make beautiful things, nobody wanted to buy them. And he fell into something of a depression, which eased in this amazing second career that he had as an author. So in 1906, he published Joseph Vance, closely followed in 1907 by a book called Alice for Short. And these two particularly sold an incredible amount of books. They were in their 6th and 7th edition in the same years as publication, and were selling not only in the UK but in the US as well. And this afforded the de Morgans a very healthy retirement. They managed to live out their final years without worrying about money, as they had done throughout their careers. And I think it came as something of quite a surprise to both of them how well de Morgan's literary career had done. So well, in fact, that most of de Morgan's obituaries mention him as an author or a writer or a celebrated novelist, and very few actually mention the ceramics at all, which is madness, I think, for us to think about today. But he was better known at the time of his death as an author. William de Morgan passed away in 1917, and his wife Evelyn de Morgan designed this beautiful headstone for the pair of them. She was later laid to rest with him when she died in 1919. The pair of them are buried at Brookwood Cemetery in Woking. So if you do want to sort of go and see this sort of final resting place, then you can still do that. You can still go and visit today and see this absolutely beautiful carved work by Evelyn de Morgan, probably one of her later or latest pieces that she ever designed in lasting memory to her husband. It's very much based on the spiritualism that the two believed in. In 1909, they anonymously published a volume of their automatic writing, or spirit writing, where they'd acted as spiritual mediums in contacting the departed. And that's definitely something that comes across in this gravestone design. You can see we've got this angel like spirit on the right hand side guiding up the figure who's extinguishing their torch just down here on the left, and guiding them upwards and beyond. So that just shows off yet another subject that De Morgan experimented with, was that spiritualism and that automatic writing, and that is beautifully captured by his wife for their headstone. I think that's it. There we go. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening today. It's been lovely to have you, and a brilliant excuse to go through the life and work of such a wonderful man who turned his hand to so many amazing things and really did excel in all the fields that he attempted to. So thank you very much.